Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Frontline Club. Thank you for coming tonight. I will shortly hand you over to Deborah Haynes from The Times, who's chairing tonight's discussion. But before I do so, if I can ask you to switch your phones to silent, and when it comes to questions, if you can wait for the microphone, because we are broadcasting live this evening. So over to Deborah.
Thank you. Hi there, good evening, everybody. Obviously, we're here tonight, female war journalism, and who better to do that than the two people we have here. And we've got Patrick Garrett, who is actually the nephew of Clare Hollingworth, and has written a book, or is finalising a book about her life as literally a legend in war journalism. It's not everybody who can say that they broke the news that the Second World War had started, and obviously she did that. And then we also have Jane Rogoyska, who is a director and an author, and has written a book about Gerda Taro, who was maybe less well known than Clare, because sadly her life was cut off very early on in her career as a photojournalist covering the Spanish Civil War. But Jane's book, Gerda Taro Inventing Robert Capa, is over here, and I think you're going to talk all about that. And then bringing it to the modern day, we have Kate Brooks here, who is a modern day photojournalist, starting out at the age of 23, covering the post 9/11 era, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and more recently the Arab Spring. So she's going to be able to bring kind of a modern feel to what it's like to be a female journalist. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Patrick to talk about Clare.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's see if I can get and maximise. Sorry, I'm not an Apple creature, which... oh, well, okay, here we go.
Right.
Good, in business. Good, I thought it's got about 5 minutes to go through a life that's 102 years and counting, so I've got to make it fairly snappy. And I reckon it's about 5 seconds a year. So I think I'll stick to the simple formula of who, what, where, when, how, and why, which has always served journalists well. Who? Well, that seems easy. Clare Hollingworth, glamorous from a rich, privileged aristocratic family in Leicestershire. Hunt balls and well-educated, born on the 10th of October 1911, the day the Wuchang Rebellion began in China, which is significant for the way that Clare's life and fate has turned out. The reality, though, is actually somewhat different, as I discovered. It fits the story very well, someone from a rich, privileged background choosing to go into war journalism. But actually, Clare came from a pretty modest background. Her father was a travelling salesman, and although he married the daughter of the owner of the shoe company he worked for, and so did, I suppose, marry into money. Clare's background is really quite simple, but I think it fitted the feature stories well that she was this very glamorous lady, and indeed she had the photographs to back it up, but the reality is actually somewhat different, as you see from her modest home. The when should be simpler, taking her favourite possession, her passport, and I've got a stack of almost all the passports apart from those that were lost and stolen during the war. So 10th of October 1911, but actually if you look closely, not true. 10th of October 1909. I was quite surprised in my research to discover that, because she makes a big song and dance about being born on the day that China began, modern China. But actually I discovered that she did that for a very good reason. She added years to her life. Let's face it, few people add years to their life unless you're trying to go and buy drink underage. But Clare did that because when she was starting out in the world, being a young lady, having a couple of extra years was very useful. And when I found other documents when she joined the Royal Institute of International Affairs. She's probably their oldest living member. She added even more years to her age, so she found it was useful. It got her into a bit of a pickle, though, because many of her documents later in life, every reissued passport, surprise, surprise, is also going to be 1909. And it was only when she was in her 50s that she somehow managed to reset the clock. I found a passport with a torn-out page, and when I asked her about it, she said, yes, I said to the passport officer, the page has been torn out, and she was able to re-enter her date, which obviously these days with biometrics would be a bit tougher and would probably land you a hefty fine. But I tell this story knowing that the statute of limitations on that has passed. What? Well, that's the easy bit. I think everyone who knows about Clare knows the start of the Second World War, 1st of September 1939, 75th anniversary coming up. And that is where she made her name, her reputation, a woman at war. And certainly she was always, an exciting aunt to know. You probably don't recognise the chap with the hair on the right as me, and that's my great aunt Clare. And so, she inspired me to seek a career in journalism, which I did straight after school. But how or why did Clare follow a career or seek a career in journalism? And that her autobiography doesn't really answer. She had a book out in about 1990, but she's not really interested in herself. She's interested in the events around her. And so the book doesn't really answer that question. And when I came to Hong Kong, I tried to ask the questions, but most of the stories seemed to have been told already. I didn't really make much progress until I discovered a trunk containing a cache of interesting documents, and so that's really what got me back on the trail, and I decided there was a book to be written to explain how Clare moved from, as you see her there, still in a reporter's mac, and I thought even the cuddly toy, it has that ring of the sort of tabloid journalist, an abandoned child's toy from the war, some war correspondent in the tabloids. How she moved to this, but that was by the end of the Second World War. She got 2 books behind her. She had hobnobbed with generals and shahs and kings and reported from most of the major fronts of the war. But she gives the impression she was always convinced she was going to be in journalism, but again, not really true. She started off more in politics, working for the League of Nations Union, predecessors of the League of Nations. They were campaigning for many of the same ideas and ideals of the League of Nations, trying to go and bring peace in the post-World War I world, all the different arms treaties that were being negotiated. That's what fascinated. That's 1934. She was billed as having actually been to Geneva. The press article says if in those days, in 34, age 23, that was really something quite significant. Her travels were really what gave her the key to journalism. Her passport is packed with stamps, those Nazi stamps, show she was travelling all over Germany, and that gave her the key to be in Poland in 1939. She was able to cross Germany. At the height of the Sudeten crisis, Hitler had just moved into Prague, refugees were fleeing, and the nearest safe border was Poland. Clare moved into the British Consulate General and dealt with refugee applications, getting to third countries. And she saved between 2,000 and 3,000 people, or should I say the organisation she headed in Poland. She passes that over in a paragraph in her book. Not interesting, unrelated to journalism. It's a whole fascinating chapter for me. That's what got into journalism, into Poland. But she fell out with various significant people in authority, and her career in refugee work ended. She pitched back in Britain on the eve of the Ribbentrop Pact, where Hitler and Stalin had done a deal over Poland, and because she knew Poland, she walked straight into a job at the Telegraph. And so her first out-of-town job was Katowice, southern Poland, as a stringer. And a week later, the war broke out, and I'm just going to give you a quick 2-minute clip of her telling Sue Lawley about that experience. So, if we can, we're rolling.
Which signalled the beginning of World War II. You were a young woman of 27 in her first journalistic job with the Daily Telegraph, and of all places, you were on the Polish border. How did you discover that the Nazis were about to roll in?
I was staying with the British Consul General, who was an old friend, and I knew the border was closed, but it was open to flagged cars to enable the Germans to get into Poland. So I said to him, "May I borrow your car?" And he said, "Where do you want to go, old girl?" Everybody was old girl then. And so I said, "I want to go into Germany." And he said, "Aren't you a funny old girl? Of course you can borrow the car." The border guard were a bit surprised when they saw the Union Jack flying, but they let me in.
You were driving, were you?
I was driving, and I bought aspirin and white wine and things you couldn't get then inside Poland, or in that part of Poland. And then I was driving back along a valley, and there was Hessian screen up, so you couldn't look down into the valley. And suddenly there was a great gust of wind, which blew the Hessian, the sacking, from its moorings. And I looked down into the valley and saw scores, if not hundreds, of tanks. So when I got back, I said, "Thank you for lending me your car." He said, "Where did you go, old girl?" So I said, "I went into Germany." He said, "Stop being funny." So I said, "Well, look in the boot and you'll see the things I bought there. And what's more, I've got a very good story. The tanks are already lined up for invasion of Poland."
Did he believe you?
And of course he believed me. And he went upstairs and sent a top-secret message to the Foreign Office. I rang Hugh Carlton Green, who's my boss in Warsaw, and we sent a story. There were no bylines in those days.
So you didn't get any credit for it then? Your name didn't appear?
On the front page it said, "From our own correspondents in Silesia or in Katowice." And then 3 days later, they came in on the 1st of September. The tanks rolled in. And I remember telephoning to Robin Hankey.
He was the secretary at the embassy in Warsaw.
Yes, and saying, "Robin, the war's begun." He said, "Rubbish, they're still negotiating." So I said, "Can't you hear it?" And I put the telephone out of the window so he could hear the tanks rolling in.
Record number 2.
I
There we go.
like to hear.
So they won't
Remind
recognise
me
who it was.
of
Okay, yeah. So Claire, no one says it better than Claire. She's told that story a million times. In the research, I actually discovered a photograph of that very car, the diplomatic car, still tucked into an old Polish photo labs envelope. So I don't think anyone has seen. I think this is the first time this has been shown publicly. The very car. However, that ended after she really wanted to get back into refugee work. So all this, I always wanted to be a journalist. She actually was pretty keen to go into refugee work. However, she'd fallen in with some interesting characters in her refugee work. These were some this was one of the Comintern agents she got mixed up with, and it made her rather unpopular with the British authorities. Her career in refugee work was brought to a halt, and therefore she had to go into journalism. It was actually she was forced back in. It wasn't really her choice. So where did she go? Well, basically, Olivia Manning's Fortunes of War covers it pretty well. She was everywhere where Olivia Manning was. They were in the same cities. They had mutual friends. And some of Claire's activities do actually turn up in Olivia's books. And I think that since Claire's book came first, I think some of the anecdotes might have been lifted. Claire became a journalist in North Africa. Registered, she got the uniform. In those days you had to have a uniform to be a war correspondent, and she was everywhere on all the fronts. That's her in northern Iran when the British and the Soviets invaded Iran. That's in Tabriz. She was after the war covering the Greek Civil War straight after the end of the war in '45. She was in North Africa and the subcontinent in the 50s and 60s. She was in Vietnam, of course. She was with Tim Page during the Tet Offensive in '68. I'll come back to that picture. On the banks of the Suez during the ongoing Middle East conflicts. And when most people were retiring, age 60-something, past the retirement age for women, she was pitched up in the People's Republic of China. And the tail end of the Cultural Revolution. I think she blends in rather well there, actually, and she was there until '65, before coming back to Britain for the last stretch as defence correspondent for the Telegraph, first female defence correspondent at that paper. And then when she should have retired at 70, well after the normal retirement age, she bopped off to Hong Kong and managed to get a Sunday Telegraph, so she basically dodged the retirement bullet and kept on writing. And the thing that really surprised me in my research was how active she was. People thought she had kind of retired, but actually she was stringing for so many defence journals, writing under bylines, using her ex-husband's name as a byline because she didn't want to be identified because of the defence correspondence she was doing at the time. I pitched up in Hong Kong in the 90s and got her story. And I've spent the last sort of 7 years retracing her steps. That's me in Vietnam at the spots that she was with Tim Page in the photograph just last month. And so the book is really showing the development of her journalism from the days of telegrams up to Twitter, her experiences with the enemies of the state. Kim Philby, she broke the story. Donald MacLean, she knew well, and Melinda, his wife, MacLean's wife, and also her experiences with MI5, where she became something of an enemy of the state. The romances, her 2 marriages, which she doesn't really talk much in her book, but it's obviously an important part. And the end of empire she watched. Of course, the British Empire reached its height in her childhood, and she saw the final countdown in Hong Kong, where she remains today. Borrowed this one from Kate Adie, but it's obviously exactly the subject we're talking about today, how the role has very much changed. Her final battle, that's actually ongoing, because she's now 102, she's virtually blind, very deaf, she's still healthy but very frail, but unfortunately her final battle takes place in the courts of Hong Kong. In 2003 she had a fall, she was taken to hospital, and someone helped her, gained signing access to her checkbook and moved her life savings to his bank account for her own good. Didn't bother to tell any of the family. We discovered 2 years later he'd redirected her bank statements to his home, so she was unaware, and 1.5 million Hong Kong dollars were moved. We asked for an account of the money, he resisted in court, and a long battle took place in Hong Kong. A settlement was reached, he owes her over 1.5 million Hong Kong dollars, and he refuses to pay. That's ongoing. Claire is running out of money fast, and Hong Kong is not a cheap place to live. But obviously moving at her age is also impossible. So that's the story. That was her on her 100th birthday, and she still retains her old habits. She still insists on, she will not sleep unless her passport is beside her bed and her shoes beside her bed. And I'm not joking, that's no anecdote, in case the Telegraph calls. Obviously, she wouldn't be able to respond now, but her helpers will often switch the news to Bloomberg rather than BBC, because she gets stressed if there's a breaking news story involving conflict, because she thinks she might be sent to it. She's aware. It's in some ways it's what keeps her going. Sad in one way, but one can be proud of her in another. And the shoes by the bed, she has to be ready to go, and she'll put the light out, and she'll reach one more time always to check her passport is there. And we've renewed her passport. We think it's unlikely she'll be doing much major travelling, but she will not sleep without her passport. And that is Clare Hollingworth. Thank you.
Account of a woman who literally lives journalism right to the very end. Is she 102 or 104?
She's actually 102. I got the birth certificate out, and she is only 102. Yeah.
Well, from one amazing woman to another.
Well, yes, and listening to that, it was very interesting, because one of the very few books that have been written about Gerda Taro, it opens with a chapter where the author speculates about going to visit Gerda Taro had she survived, and imagines her being a 90-year-old woman, and he goes up to her flat in Paris and goes to visit her, and there she is surrounded by cats, reminiscing about the Spanish Civil War. Sadly, this was not to be, because Gerda Taro is widely believed or held to be the first female photojournalist to die in battle, and she was killed on the front line at the Battle of Brunete during the Spanish Civil War at the age of just 26. Had she lived, she would be 103, so because she was born in 1910, so 1 year before Clare. And what I'm going to do, I'm not going to talk through a presentation, but first of all, I'm just going to put on a few images of her photographs and of her, so that you could just get a flavour just to let you know, for copyright reasons, I'm not able to show you the photographs in all their beauty, but they're taken spreads from the book, so hopefully they will give you an idea. So if I can just, I might just have to swap places with you.
Yep.
Am I able to do that? Oh God, we've got leads.
There we go.
When there's a lead issue going on.
There's a lead issue. Right, okay, so mine's in keynotes. I have to get rid of that. It's down here. Done?
I'll lift the back of your chair up.
Okay. So these will just give you a little bit of a flavour of what she looked like, who she was, and the photographs that she took. And the thing that obviously you'll notice, and this person here, Robert Capa, who I believe is probably rather better known to most people. I'm not going to talk while the pictures are there, I'll just let you have a look, and then I'll just briefly give you an account of her very short life. So the final image that you see there is what's known as the Mexican suitcase, which, as you could see, wasn't a suitcase at all. It was a box, but rather like your box of interesting documents, this was the kind of key to the rediscovery of who Gerda Taro was and what her legacy might be. And it was a box full of negatives taken by Robert Capa, Gerda Taro, and another photographer called Shim, David Seymour, during the Spanish Civil War, which had been kept by Capa and lost for many, many years and only rediscovered in 2007. And what was in this box were 4,500 negatives taken from a brief period during the Spanish Civil War. And it helped to kind of reset the story of who had taken what photograph and when. So just to take you back a bit, who was Gerda Taro? Well, she wasn't Gerda Taro at all. Her real name, and Robert Capa wasn't Robert Capa. I'm sure many of you already know that, but her real name was Gerda Pohoriles. She was born in 1910, and she was brought up in Stuttgart, in Germany, in a middle-class Jewish family, and I think every expectation for her when she was growing up was that she would lead a kind of fairly normal middle-class life, marry well, give parties, and, you know, perhaps run a business for a while. But there was very little suggestion early on that she was going to be a journalist, a photographer. Photography was not on her radar at all. But of course, just as Claire, she had the fortune or the misfortune to live in, I suppose, what the Chinese would call interesting times. And by 1929, when she was 19 years old, with Germany in the grip of, you know, increasing conflict between left and right, world depression, her father was forced to move to Leipzig. And with anti-Semitism on the rise, the Nazis beginning their inexorable path towards power, she had to make a choice, and the choice was, do I become politically active and engaged, or do I go on carrying on with my life as it was originally set out to be? And the choice she took was to become engaged. She became politically active, she got involved in left-wing politics, and as a consequence was arrested by the Nazis and had to flee Germany along with most of her friends in 1933. And so, along with most of the Weimar, you know, leading light, she ended up in Paris. And unlike her very good friends who had a bit more money and a sort of a little bit more of a sort of thing to hold her up, she was penniless, she had no connections, and all she really had was a talent to survive. She was very intelligent, but she had no focus for that talent yet. She was like a sort of intelligence looking for a vocation. And then a man came into her life who was younger than her. He was 22 years old, and his name was Andre Friedman. And he was also Hungarian, also Jewish, also fleeing his native Hungary, which was then under a fascist dictatorship, for his left-wing views. And he was a talented young photographer, but he was kind of chaotic, very good-looking, very charming, very, very handsome, but given to big flights of fancy and thinking that he was going to do very, very well, and then slightly messing things up and falling into despair. And at the time when she met him, he was really on the borderline between whether he could survive or not. And he kept saying, you know, I'm going to give it all up, I'm going to give it all up. And then he would just set one more, you know, little assignment that would keep him going. And it was one of these little assignments to keep him going that brought him into contact with Gerda Taro. He got a job for her to take some rather dull pictures for an insurance brochure. And what was needed for the brochure was a good-looking, blonde, slightly Aryan-looking girl, and he didn't know anyone like that. So he went to his local cafe where, you know, many of the people hung out, and he saw a beautiful young blonde girl there, and her name was Ruth Surf, and she happened to be Gerda Taro flatmate and best friend. And when he approached Ruth, who was equally penniless but very glamorous looking, and said, I'd like to take some photographs of you in a little park round the corner in Paris, she was a little hesitant and not entirely convinced, that because he was very rough looking and he was unshaven and he used to wear this old leather jacket. But, you know, she needed the money, he promised to pay her, and she took her friend Gerda along for company. And Gerda and Andre hit it off. They became friends, they then became lovers. And there became the moment where their story became entwined. Because what he brought to her was photography. And he taught her photography. He became her teacher. And what she brought to him was her intelligence, her understanding of the importance of appearance, her understanding of business, and her drive. And together they formed a partnership, which was initially him taking photographs and her sort of managing him and being his agent. But he was teaching her all the time. And as they struggled in this very, very busy, crowded Paris, where everyone was trying to, you know, get the latest assignment, they just couldn't make ends meet. So then they came up with this rather daring idea, where they didn't just decide, well, you know what, here we are, we're penniless Jewish emigres, we can't get our foot in the door, let's change our names. They went one step further and they said, let's invent someone else. And so they invented this guy called Robert Capa. And Robert Capa was an American, conveniently, who'd never been to Europe, which was why no one had ever met him. And he was very, very successful, and he was very wealthy. He was all the things that Andre Friedman wasn't. And they kind of came up with this notion that Andre Friedman would kind of be the darkroom guy, and Gerda, now christened Gerda Taro, would be his agent, and she would sell the photographs. And they started this ruse, and, you know, there's a lot of mythology surrounding this story, and a lot of it's anecdotal, and it gets bigger and more elaborate as you go through history. But it's a very pleasing story, and we don't know how long it went on before he was uncovered. But by the time he was uncovered, nobody really minded very much, and he was taking photographs, and they were known as Robert Capa. Only 3 months later, the Spanish Civil War broke out, and they both decided, with great engagement and political passion, that they wanted to go and cover it. And this was going to be Gerda's first assignment as a professional photographer. And they went out there in the August of 1936, shortly after the war had broken out, taking photographs on the Republican side, and they, over the next year, they travelled around Spain, going backwards and forwards to Paris, sometimes as a team, sometimes independently. And during this single year, she created a body of work which I think stands up to scrutiny, to photographic scrutiny, and which became her small legacy. And she started as the pupil, with Andre very much, I still call him Andre, Robert Capa, as the teacher. But as he came to prominence, not as many people believe because of the falling soldier famous photograph, but initially actually because of his very compassionate and beautiful photographs of the siege of Madrid over the winter of 1936 to 37, which were the first moments when he really became known as a photographer and started headlining as Capa. She started to feel rather overshadowed by this enormous talent. And because in exactly the same way with Clare, that initially credits, bylines, you know, nobody was very careful about that kind of thing. They'd always put their photographs under the name of Capa. And then gradually that she came to the realization that Capa was him, and where was she? So she had to carve out a place for herself as Gerda Taro, and she became more and more independent. And as she became more and more independent, she distanced herself from him, and she took on more and more solo assignments, desperately trying to make herself stand out. And at the same time, she grew more and more obsessed with the war and more engaged with the suffering of the Spanish people. And I think this is where perhaps there's a little dividing line for war journalists, I think, between your commitment, and I'm sure you two will have much more to say about this, your commitment to bearing witness and becoming too engaged. And I think Gerda lost perhaps the ability to make that distinction at a crucial time. And in July, at the Battle of Brunete, without Capa by her side, she got so involved taking photographs, she stayed too long at the front, and with one day to go before she was due to return to Paris, she was killed. In fact, she was killed accidentally. She was on her way back from the front, and she was killed by an out-of-control Republican tank. And the little bubblegum card that you saw in the slideshow was a card that was made shortly after her death that depicted this horrible moment. For a brief moment, her fame shone brightly, and she was the darling of left-wing newspapers, and she was lauded as a kind of Joan of Arc. But unfortunately, you know, she died at the age of 26. She had a small body of work, and shortly after the Spanish Civil War, the Second World War came along and eclipsed in all its horrors and in every single way everything that had happened in the Spanish Civil War. And because there was no one left, particularly after Capa himself died at the age of 40 in 1952. I think it was 1952. There was no one left to guard her legacy. And so it took a very, very long time before anyone really encouraged her to come out of the shadows and started digging deep enough to find her as someone other than Robert Capa's partner and girlfriend. So I'll stop there and hand over to you guys.
Thank you. Well, it's a fascinating look at the way that female journalists operated, you know, back in the 1930s and during the Second World War, to bring us a more sort of modern day perspective on what it's like to be particularly a photojournalist. We've got Kate here. Do you want to talk about what you've been doing? You've obviously written books, won awards, travelled across the world. What's it been like?
Well, a loaded question. Well, I've been a sort of professional photographer at this point for 16 years. So, I started working in sort of Russia when I was 20, sort of documenting systematic child abuse in Russian state. I sort of had a fascination with conflict photography. There certainly was a long period of time when, I didn't know whether or not I was capable of it. And actually, it was in the summer of 1996. Actually, so I was 18 at the time. It was before I was working as a professional photographer, and I oddly had started going to Russia when I was a teenager because I had gone to a boarding school and studied Russian there, and we had an exchange program. So in the summer of '96, it was after my freshman year of college. I took a photojournalism class my first semester of my freshman year that was taught by a photo editor at National Geographic, and he was regularly bringing in photographers. And just, in the year before, I had started taking pictures, and I was spending time in Russia. And when I was sort of flicking through the course catalog and came across a description of photojournalism, I said, oh, this is really interesting. It's kind of what, in a way I've started doing. And I enrolled in the class, and it wasn't until I was in that class that it ever occurred to me that I could become a photographer or a photojournalist by profession. Until then, it was very much sort of a budding hobby of mine. And I was a Russian major. In the summer of '96, so later that year, I sort of initiated a trip back to Russia. I'd gone to Russia a few times at that point, and sort of randomly met a large group of photographers. And at the time, between the elections and the war in Chechnya that was going on, some of the best photographers in the world were sort of passing through. And I met them one day in Red Square, so they began sort of inviting me to get-togethers, and I slowly sort of became sort of surrounded by these great photographers who I admired. And I remember that summer there was a moment when there was a photographer who was going off to Chechnya along with another photographer, and they said, you know, you can come. And I was really conflicted because on the one hand I wanted to go, and on the other hand I thought, I'm in Russia on a tourist visa. I have $400 to my name. I have no body armor. And I just knew it went against all of my better judgment, whatever that was at the age of 18, but I just knew that was not smart for me to do. And I put myself on a train and sort of went off to the Arctic Circle and photographed coal miners for 10 days just because I kind of hated being left behind when I knew that they were there. But I worked for, you know, a good sort of 4 years as a freelance photographer before I really sort of got into covering conflict. And it was, for me, it was 9/11. I was sent to sort of Pakistan for, you know, a 4-day assignment. And just when I arrived, the U.S. began bombing Afghanistan. And I thought, you know, this is the beginning of a very big story. And, you know, I was 23, I had nothing really sort of tying me anywhere. And I decided to take a house and relocated to Islamabad. And, you know, sort of, it's interesting to me, I mean, all these years later, I was the only freelance photographer in the world at that point in time to relocate to Pakistan. And the idea was I wanted to be fully focused on what I was doing. I didn't want to have to be traveling out of the region to go home. And I didn't want to miss a beat. It was all about, you know, positioning myself to cover Afghanistan and doing some work in Pakistan. And so, I worked in Afghanistan throughout 2002, went on to cover the invasion of Iraq in 2003. And, you know, when I think back on those times, I mean, at that point in time, the question of whether to cover the invasion of Iraq or not to cover the invasion of Iraq never entered my mind. You know, I was going to be there. It was a question of which front I was going to cover the war from. And basically, I continued working in the region, and you know, over a decade sort of passed. And so at this point, you know, I do work in other parts of the world, but have really spent an extensive amount of time, most of my adult life, sort of, you know, covering that post 9/11 decade and the beginning of the Arab Spring. Thank you very much. Very long. Sorry.
I guess I could talk a little bit about the print side of things, because I guess I'm kind of a modern day print type person. I think similar to you, my career has kind of been shaped by 9/11. I never ever set out to be doing war. Incidentally, I became the first female defence editor for the Times, which is maybe a sign of how females are still, you know, not unusual on the front line, but unusual especially in defence reporting, and we said in photojournalism as well, war photojournalism. So there's still a lot of work, glass ceilings to break through. But I wanted to be a foreign correspondent, and I studied Japanese at university. And all I wanted to do was to go and work in Tokyo and cover Japan. And so I was in Tokyo when 9/11 happened, and I can remember I worked for AFP. I was their economics editor, so pretty much as far away from a war as you could possibly imagine. And I was 25 at the time, and I remember saying to my editor when 9/11 happened, yeah, and America started invaded Afghanistan. Oh, can I go? To like guffaws of like laughter at the idea of sending someone like me there. And then then obviously Iraq happened. And I think by the time a year after the Iraq invasion, they were getting pretty fed up with my kind of nagging, please send me. And at this time I was working in Geneva, and I was covering the UN and kind of Swiss news for AFP. I remember a particularly good story writing about battles of cows, and also the highest station in Europe, which is in Switzerland, very interesting. And they told, I remember getting a phone call from AFP, and they said to me, do you want to go to Baghdad? I was like, yes. Can you be there next week? I was like, yes. And I'd just been snowboarding, and so I could just think of like snow, and I couldn't imagine heat. And I can remember sort of looking on the internet to see about the weather in Baghdad, and there was no weather forecast in Baghdad in those days. Well, they had, for whatever reason, it was a war. But I remember in Amman it said it had been snowing. Like, oh, maybe it's quite cold. It was February time. So I packed like a big sort of ski jacket and moon boots, and I went to Amman, and they gave me, the AFP gave me $3,000 and told me to stuff it in my pants in case I got hijacked on the way to Baghdad. I was getting a taxi. I thought it was quite cool. I didn't get hijacked, but the guy who I replaced did get hijacked on the way back, so hopefully he kept his money safe too. And that was kind of how it started. So it was February 2004. In Baghdad, had absolutely no experience whatsoever of conflict, had no idea that a high-velocity bullet went straight through walls, unlike in the films, and you can hide behind cars and be safe. And I can remember not much happened initially, and I remember specifically emailing friends back home, like typical, I go to Baghdad and the war stops. With the first huge bombing that I'd ever had the misfortune, and I guess as a journalist, fortune, to be there to report on, and it was one of the Ashura bombings when about more than 100 people were killed, and it was like the chaos and the craziness and the unexpected nature of being in the heart of what was then and still is. It's like it was the global news story. It was history happening in front of your eyes, and that was it. I was completely hooked. You know, Japan was forgotten, and I carried on reporting in Iraq for AFP, and then I moved to the Times, and then came back to the UK and was their I'm their defence editor, and I covered as well Afghanistan and Libya. So yeah, that was me. Anyway, we've had. I imagine you've got like loads of questions, particularly for our two colleagues here talking about the historic nature of female war correspondence. So over to you if you want to ask questions, please do.
I might start by just asking maybe Kate and all of you really to talk a little bit about how things have changed for women on the front lines. I mean, Claire probably saw quite a lot of change throughout her life in terms of women working. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yes, you start. You start.
No,
You start.
no,
No.
you please.
Start from the left. Start from the left.
No.
Actually, maybe start with you, Patrick, and talk
Okay.
about the history.
No choice. No choice. Yeah. I mean, Claire's interesting actually. I mean, her actual attitude to other women. She was not supportive at all because they were competition, and she was a very forceful character, and so she could tolerate her male colleagues, but she was much less supportive of female colleagues because that was her little niche, and so that I would note. How it's changed. I mean, she wrote in the 60s how she thought that women who behaved themselves on the front line were tolerated. It was the ones that caused trouble that gave all women a bad reputation. And she was very. She talked about the Desert War, where some unnamed correspondent had insisted on their liaison officer driving them 3 miles off into the dunes to find a discreet place to use the loo. And Claire thought that was outrageous on the front line, and people who demanded showers all the time were giving women a bad reputation. So that was her attitude. I mean, but it was the objective. I think was to establish herself ahead of the others, ahead of the pack, and so that's perhaps my first comment on Claire and how it has changed.
Well, I would say that now there's many sort of female foreign correspondents and war correspondents, I wouldn't say that before this evening, I was counting, the number of female photographers, who are known for having regularly covered conflict or having done some significant bodies of work, over the last 30 years. And you're still talking about, a couple of dozen women. It's still very, very small group of people. We all know each other. But lots of things have changed. Just before the talk began, I was reflecting on an article that ran in the Atlantic about a year ago, I believe, and it was about the fact that the bureau chief of NPR in Beirut, the bureau chief of Time magazine in Beirut, and the bureau chief of the New York Times in Beirut are all women. Who are all married and have children and had, husbands who were sort of supporting them in the roles of being these foreign correspondents who were very, very much focused on covering Syria. So I think that's very, very sort of new. You wouldn't have found that 10 years ago, 20 years ago. So.
Definitely.
Yeah, well, I guess as a mum myself, I think I've noticed the difference of when you're not just as a human being, when you're not a parent. It doesn't matter if you're a female or a male. When you're not a parent, covering war is it's much less. You can be completely selfish. Whereas when you become a parent, you're slightly more aware of your own mortality and the fact that if you kind of lose a few limbs or your life, then it's not just you that's affected. It's like your children. But I think that's true for men and women, and it is an obstacle that's the gender thing is becoming less of an issue, I think. Yes, lady at the front there.
Hi, I was just wondering whether you thought, and in what ways, whether women covering conflict, whether it be in the Spanish Civil War in the 30s or with your great aunt or your good selves, whether that brought a different dimension or they replicated male work. I could say something there. Well, actually, because there was, when Gerda Taro died, there was a little piece about her, and I think it was in Life magazine, and they showed some of her photographs, and one of the things they showed some pictures that she'd taken of children, and it said something like, and here are the kind of photographs that pretty Gerda Taro was really good at taking, and actually was very unrepresentative of what she had set out to do, which actually were action photographs, and the kind of blurry action dynamic photographs that she really prided herself on, or the more sort of propagandic ones, were important to her. But at the same time, posthumously, there was much more of a sort of push to identify her with a certain kind of pictures. And conversely, from the other sort of side of the fence, when you look at the early spreads from the Spanish Civil War, there were a lot of pictures of women at war, and it was very popular, and all the newspapers wanted them. But actually the truth was that there were never more than about 1,000 women at the front line during the Spanish Civil War, and they weren't allowed to be there for very long at all, and very quickly they were pushed back. I'm talking about the ones who were fighting. So, from the kind of the other side of the lens, if you like, there was a big thirst to see all these sort of glamorous women holding guns, but actually very quickly the reality changed.
Yeah, I mean, did Clare write differently? I mean, I think she wrote actively very neutrally and would not actively take a sort of a female viewpoint on something. I know her coverage in northern Iran when the Soviets and British invaded. She did comment on the role of the Red Army soldier and the Red Army commissar and how they fought just like the men, and that was a particular point she raised. In Vietnam, Martha Gellhorn was there for The Guardian, freelancing for The Guardian at the same time as Clare had just become staff with The Guardian. And Clare was battling to get in and actually doing her best to do down Martha Gellhorn in her coverage, because Martha wasn't covering the battles as they should be, in Clare's view. And in correspondence with Alistair Hetherington, the editor of The Guardian at the time, Clare saying Martha's poor coverage. Hetherington, on the other hand, was very impressed with Gellhorn's coverage because she covered a very broad issue. Claire's point was she just doesn't get the technology. She just doesn't understand the weapons that are being used. But Hetherington was very firm. He wanted the broad coverage, whereas Clare really just wanted the stens and the brens, as she always referred to it. A good guy was a man who knew his sten from his bren. And she's once quoted, I think, in the Sunday Times Colour Mag, where she says, I can strip down a gun as quickly as any man. And I actually don't know whether she could. I somehow doubt it, but that was the sort of lines that she was fond of. And
what do you think? Do you think you take different pictures to your male colleagues? Or?
I think the only thing that, and it's very specific to working in the Muslim world, is that women have better access to the world of women. And so inevitably it does affect the pictures you take, because occasionally men are able to really get intimately photograph women in the Middle East or in Afghanistan and Pakistan, but for the most part, that view is one that only women can capture. So.
Hi. When did you discover and how that your great aunt was a little bit different than other great aunts?
Probably on the 30th of March 1967, the day I was born, in the Lanesborough Hotel in London. It used to be a hospital, and it's now one of the top 5-star hotels. I haven't been back since. But she bowled into the hotel, into the hospital, outside visiting hours, and security held her back. She was furious. She's not known to be refused anything. And an angry letter was sent up to my mother upstairs about these awful people, and hoped that my mother would escape soon. So I suppose on the day of my birth, I pretty much sussed that my aunt was different. But I was always a great fan of hers. I pilot myself, and interested in that sort of technology. So she was I could call her up at the Telegraph, and I'd ask her what she thought of was it a good thing that Britain was replacing the Phantom in 1976 with the Tornado MRCA, and she was that was she'd happy to talk about that. She's glad to have someone to talk to about it. Letters as kids. One of the first letters I got from her was a discussion of whether we needed manned aircraft and whether guided missiles could do that job just as well. And that was that would have been 1976 or something. I was about 9 years old. I remember it vividly because that's what I was interested in too. And let's face it, with the way that drones had developed, she was spot on. I've known for a while.
Thanks. Kate, you've sort of touched on the starting point for my question in terms of your access to the world of women in patriarchal countries, but I'm curious about your access to the world of men and how that operates in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and I suppose for the others, being a woman journalist or photojournalist in a rather macho world perhaps has advantages but also disadvantages. So I'm curious about your reflections on those two things.
Yeah, oddly, foreign women in that part of the world are not really subjected to the same rules as local women. So I've always said you kind of end up, it's like being a third sex, where you're sort of given sort of the same, access as a man, but cared for like a woman, generally speaking. So it's actually quite a privileged position. I would say by and large, that's been my experience. And I think, throughout, since 2001, I think there's been once, and it was in a mosque where I wasn't, permitted access. But in terms of photographing sort of men and being around men in these countries, it's never been a problem.
Actually, I found that being a woman often is quite an advantage because of the disguise you can wear. Like you can cover your face up and pretty much go anywhere, which is really useful. I guess on the print side of things, you're often there are lots of occasions where you meet men and they think you're just a little blonde-haired girl who doesn't really know very much. And they tend to kind of relax more. And it can work both ways. They can relax more and tell you things, thinking that you're too stupid to understand it. But then equally, they can think you are too stupid to understand it, so they don't tell you things. I wouldn't say it's 100% positive, or it's kind of like a halfway thing. And I remember just a weird anecdote from when I was in Iraq with the Times. They couldn't afford to keep a photojournalist out with me, so they just kind of gave me a camera, and I'm horrendous at taking photos. I've got no ambitions. And so I used to sort of scattergun, do loads of photos and send loads of them and hope one would get in. And I remember being in Samara, and there's a big sort of a mosque there, a very famous mosque, and I wasn't allowed in to take a picture. And so there's like some Iraqi worker who was there, and I was like, oh, do you mind, through your translator, do you mind taking a few pictures of the dome? And so he went off and took some pictures, and it was like the front page of Foreign, and then with my name on it. And then, like, genuinely, about 2 years later, out of the blue, I get an email from some artist asking permission, so he was moved by the photo. Can you please sort of capture it in a painting? So somewhere, someone's taken a painting of this random picture that wasn't mine because I was a woman.
Yeah, well, I think for Gerda it was very, the Spanish Civil War was the first war that was actually documented by sort of freelance photographers with lightweight cameras. It was the first kind of media war, so it was all very new. And there were quite a few women out there reporting on it, but she was, obviously you've seen, she was incredibly pretty, and she knew how to make herself look very glamorous. And there are quite a lot of anecdotes that sort of suggest that maybe she played on that a little bit. But then when you look at the photographs of her when she's in Spain, I've never seen a single one where she's not without makeup, in the kind of blue boiler suit. And I think she made a point, her whole thing was solidarity, so I think she made a real point of trying to sort of fit in and be not one of the guys at all, but to be in solidarity with the people whose photographs she was taking. And that was the big thing for her. When she was with Capa, they were this kind of partnership. They were very glamorous, they were very good looking, they always were telling jokes, so everybody loved it when they were around. And because a lot of the journalists tended to kind of watch from the distance, sit there with their notebooks, far away, they had this reputation for being there with the men, and they were very beloved by many of the troops. And there's a lovely story when they go to visit one of the brigades, one of the international brigades, and Capa had brought a movie camera with him, and he was very excited because he had sort of aspirations to be a movie cameraman, which sadly never revealed themselves to be of any great worth, because it turned out that actually he was a great still photographer. So he'd get the movie camera and he'd put it like that, and that would be it, and people would run past it. But they arrived at this front where nothing much was happening, and there's a lovely cartoon by the battalion cartoonist that depicts the excitement of all these men who'd been sitting there with nothing to do for months, with these two glamorous kind of directors come along and start taking their photographs and getting them to pose. So I'm sure she flirted, I'm sure she knew, how to take advantage of her good looks. But I think she was also very keen to express her solidarity with the people of Spain. So it was a very delicate sort of balance, I think, that she played, not always entirely honestly, I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, with Claire, I think she's probably, she could flirt, but equally, I think certainly the North Africa period in the Second World War, she was really one of the lads, and that was her novelty. She'd get taken places because she's one of the lads. She'd sleep in the desert, out in the sand under the stars. There are photographs of her in uniform where her hair's cropped so short you could have mistaken her for a bloke quite easily. So I think that was the way she played it, but she. Certainly when women were evacuated, when Rommel almost was taking Cairo, women were evacuated down to South Africa in the main. So there she enjoyed her life at the balls each night at Shepherd's. So that gave her very good access to the top military because there was a shortage of women. She was always being invited out to balls and dances every night, and that gave her very, very good contacts. Although it didn't always work for her. Montgomery particularly she fell out with. She just got into Libya, and she was one of the first people in, got an American plane, and Montgomery discovered, and she always described Montgomery as a woman hater because he said, get her out, and I always thought that might be a bit embroidered, but in Montgomery's ADC's autobiography, he confirms exactly that. The order went out: get Claire out by sunset, and I've since discovered other places. So yes, it's true, I think.
Yes.
That sounds like an absolute formidable lady.
Do you mind waiting for the microphone?
Thank you. Claire sounds like a very formidable lady. Did she ever admit to any point of fear throughout her career? And these are questions for you as well. If there was any moment of fear in your career, of any situations,
Like countless.
but one that you could really.
Why don't you start?
I mean, I almost think she actually makes up some fear. If you ask her, she says, yes, I'm terrified of being stuck in a lift. And I almost think that she's actually created that to give her a degree of human frailty. Because it's bullshit. I've been in a lift with her many times, and I've never noticed any particular palpitations, fast breathing, shaking, or anything else. I think she just created it because, for exactly that question. Everyone who's I know who's been with her, in conflict situations, so it's not just her accounts, say that her philosophy was to believe the other person's get the bullet, not you. And she says, as long as you think that, the bullet's going to get the other person, you'll be fine. I think, it works for her. I mean, yeah, these days, because she's virtually blind, she will get stressed by some things, but she's 102. But I think, in her heyday, really, there wasn't much that bothered her, no.
What's there to say? I think, over the years, I've been in a number of dangerous situations, and at times some of them were life-threatening and seemed life-threatening, or were situations in which I was concerned that somebody that I was working with may have been killed, for example, and. I actually, I don't think it's possible to be in these situations and to really sort of put yourself out there and not end up feeling fear.
Can I ask a question, actually? Do you think it's true, because there's a lot talked about the kind of addiction to war, that war journalists become addicted to the adrenaline and the kind of the sense of being totally alive. Do you think that's a myth, or is there some sort of truth in that?
I think it's really a cliche, to be honest. I mean, inevitably, I don't even think it's necessarily taking risks. I think living more than that, and people who do a lot of field work, there's their life in the field and their life at home, and you sort of go into the field and end up being largely completely immersed in what you're doing, and you forget about a lot of very trivial things that you typically deal with day to day, and that there's something very liberating about that. I would say, it's just it's an easy example, but in 2002, in the first sort of months that I was living in Kabul, everything was difficult. There were no landlines practically. There were no mobile phones. It was cold. We didn't have hot water. We slept on, sort of beds that were made from a piece of board. And you worked really hard, and you were very, very present. It's just very zen. You're very present in what you're doing. And I think it's that actually is a huge part of it. I think just sort of forgetting about all the sort of trivial things in life. Obviously, you get sort of used to a life of excitement, but I do think it's, I think that people generally, journalists generally, who are going out and taking risks in the course of doing their work are driven by something much greater than the need for a rush. Because it takes such a huge amount of commitment and dedication to do this job. I think, it's actually not very difficult to be a journalist or a photographer for a few years, but in terms of really building a career as a journalist, as a photographer, and doing it consistently for a very long time, that is very hard, and that just comes down to dedication.
Yeah, there's a lady at the back with the purple top.
These days it's all risk assessment and hostile environment training courses and the like. I just wondered how much training and preparation Claire and Gerda did and what it's like.
Answer that one very short.
Yeah, I know she obviously paid the ultimate price, and how much it's changed now, because I get the impression maybe you guys just got there.
Well, I can answer that very shortly. None, I think, would be a quick way of saying I don't think they had any kind of preparation whatsoever.
I mean, Claire, at the time, zero, but she certainly, hanging around with the military, she got a lot of information. She was very interested in tactics. She learned to fly in North Africa in the 40s so that she could better understand air warfare, was her thinking. So she was very open to know how to do things better. I remember, I think it was her predecessor at the Telegraph, Brigadier someone, taught her how to recognise every kind of munition flying overhead. So she learned, I suppose, from the military side, but in terms of actual official courses, zero. I mean, she had her own kit. She was very proud. She had 2 bags, one for hot environments, one for cold environments, permanently packed, ready to go on the phone call. So that was her preparation. But in terms of flak jackets, hostile environment and everything else, no, absolutely not.
I had none the first time I went into Afghanistan, and I remember distinctly being at Tora Bora, standing too close to a tank and flailing around on the field and sort of dropping to my knees and not being sure if it was outgoing or incoming. I mean, really just knew sort of nothing. But later, a year later, when it was clear that the invasion of Iraq was going to happen, and after having kind of been out in the field for a while, I pushed the photo agency that I worked with then to cover hostile environments training for me, and also there was CBR, chemical, biological, and training prior to the invasion of Iraq too. But in general, I personally feel that the standards in the business are very poor, and about 2 years ago, the Rory Peck Foundation sponsored the training of 18 freelancers, and I helped get a security company to do the training of 18 freelancers in the Middle East. So they had already been working for, some of them a couple of years in Libya, in Syria, in Egypt, content providers for sort of top publications in Europe, in the US, and had absolutely zero security training. And I personally don't find it acceptable.
And actually, it's like the issue as well for insurance. You need to have the training, and especially if you're embedding with the military, you're required to. But yeah, like you, I didn't have any, and actually it costs money to have it. So if you're like an asset for a company back in the day, then you just go in, and if you're any good, then they might invest in some training for you. But I similarly learnt by doing.
Reminds me of in Chechnya in 1994, went in with Channel 4, and we thought we were being very professional, that we wouldn't go till the battlefield first aid kit arrived, and it had flown in from London. I think we'd got flak jackets. I was freelancing with them at the time. We wouldn't go till the kit arrived, and then we were delayed at Moscow's Vnukovo airport for about 14 hours, and so we had time to open the kit, with all these pipes and tubes and syringe type things and needles and plasmas, and we were in discussion as to how we would use them. And the plasma, that's the stuff you use. That's anally you use that. No, that's intravenously. That's the drip. And we realised we hadn't got a clue. We weren't going to go till the kit arrived. But if we needed the kit, we wouldn't have known what to do with it. And so I immediately signed up for a freelance course with over in Aldershot, and I think they said I was the first freelancer they'd actually had paying his own way through, because I just thought it's ridiculous, schlepping this kit with us, but actually we wouldn't know whether to stick it up our nostrils, in our veins, in our arteries, or any other part of the body. And
the gentleman there, and then the gentleman at the back.
I think we've just got time for two more.
Yeah, okay.
My question is
Sorry,
about.
do you mind waiting?
I was looking at the photographs around the wall, and I've had the privilege of meeting Clare because I know Patrick. It's about the editors and who you work with, because I saw the Don McCullum documentary, and there's the gatekeepers, because these images were chosen by editors of magazines, and I'd like you to go through, ending at you, Kate, because now with almost simultaneous broadcasting and editing, because when you picked up Time magazine in 1968 or Newsweek in 1974 in student protests, as it goes through, coming to you right now, it's all very well you being at the front line. You stick your neck out, and I remember Robert Fisk saying a few years ago, there's very few editors who would definitely publish if they went out there and put their neck on the line. So I'd like to talk about, it's phenomenal what they've all done, but there's these gatekeepers who actually are the ones who choose and edit the photographs and contextualize them for the rest of us. And I'd like you to maybe talk about it. Well, Clare was with the Telegraph. I mean, who chose Clare? Who allowed her? I mean, I'm just trying, because they're out there, but
I guess
there's a kind of backroom thing that really is very powerful here.
I guess if it's a photo if it's widening the story, the question not to include photographs, I mean, the sub-editors were who tweaked Clare's writing, and that's something I found. I mean, she's not a natural writer. She's a great reporter, but her writing is not the best. She knows that, and that's, I think, one of the reasons why she's so ruthless about competitors, because she knows there were plenty of young correspondents coming up there who could write a hell of a lot better. They couldn't maybe get the access, they couldn't maybe find the facts, but they could write better. She was always conscious of that, couldn't spell to save her life. My mum as a kid used to correct her articles, so the sub-editors, though, so I know that a lot of the stuff that I'm actually reading of hers has been heavily sub-edited, and so I mean, it's like, there are major gatekeepers. Clare was the rare correspondent who was always grateful. I spoke to some Guardian veterans, and they said she was very odd. She'd always thank the subs. Now, let's face it, as you all know, most he minced my piece. You know, it's the opposite. But Clare was very grateful, because once the sub had worked his or her magic on it, Clare had a presentable piece. Prior to that, it was some great facts, some great anecdotes, but it didn't hang together as a news story as it should. So, from the word side, but pictures.
Well, I think, not just for pictures, I think for a lot of the journalists, certainly in the reading that I was doing around the Spanish Civil War, a lot of the journalists who were reporting from the Republican side spent a lot of their time with their heads in their hands that their copy was not being published, because most of the mainstream press was not particularly Republican. As for Taro, her photograph, she was on assignment for a variety of magazines, all of which were pretty left-wing. So there was Regard, there was Vue, and there was Ce Soir, which was a kind of communist-backed newspaper for a general readership. So I think they never had trouble getting their photographs shown. It was more perhaps about the kind of design concepts that went behind them, that the layout could differ widely between the better magazines, which had really beautiful layout, and something like Ce Soir, where for example, even when she died, the picture of her funeral is on the bottom of one page, and there's a picture of another funeral right next to it, and a lot of their photographs just kind of get put very higgledy-piggledy, and they had less control over that. But somewhere in 1937, at some point, Capa opened his own studio so that they could have more control over their own work, and just a little bit more control over who they were selling to, and which photographs were going where, and to try and have, I suppose it was a sort of the beginnings of what would later become Magnum and greater control. But I think for them it was mostly about getting the photographs out there, and I think Taro was certainly, because she was very early on in her career, in the first months you can kind of see a difference between photographs that she took that were very clearly the kind of things that were wanted. So these are really kind of big angles and lots of sort of lining up of troops and things that looked very sort of modernist inspired, rather sort of propagandist, and then the more human ones that she developed as she got sort of closer to the war, and and obviously they cared a lot about the credit, and then, it was not such a big issue, the byline thing, but it became very important to her, and it wasn't really until the final Battle of Brunete that the word Taro kept, appearing, because it was kind of rather random how they would be presented. But it was less an issue of getting the story, it was more how it was shown, I think, for them.
What do you think?
I think editors play an important role. If anything, now information just moves so quickly, there isn't enough time to sort of reflect on the work that's being produced, and I find that editors are genuinely far less engaged than they were once upon a time. But there are plenty of photographs, throughout my career that I personally did not particularly care for, and I would send, and they would end up being pictures that got extensively published. So it's important to have an objective eye on your work.
Do they bring something because they chose that photograph?
No, I think, different editors have different eyes, but I think it's more about, as a photographer, it's very difficult to be objective about your own work, particularly when you first take a picture. Let a year pass and I can go through the edit I would do. If I shot a story today, the edit I would do today and the edit I would do in a year from now would be totally different, because I'm there experiencing it on top of documenting it. And sometimes it's very difficult to actually separate those two things.
Can I ask you something? So when McCullen did his, he was talking about the editor, I think it was in the Times. Is there one that you have a relationship you click with, that they seem to disseminate, they get out there what you think was true? Is there somebody you work with like that?
Well, it's a whole other sort of question, because I think that the photography business has changed so much in the past 5 years. But for a very long time, I had a group of editors at Time magazine who I work with very closely, and great job editing and presenting my pictures.
Just the last question.
Last question at the back there, yeah.
There's been an idea around since ancient times that women are temperamentally, biologically more pacific than men, and someone with a better classical education than I'll be able to remind us of the ancient Greek play about the women who withhold sexual favours from their men until they stop playing at war. Someone tell us. More recently, there's been, the advance of feminism has somehow made this less plausible, it seems to me, but more recently, the peace journalism movement still seems to promote the idea that in their effort to give equal news value to conflict resolution efforts, very often led by women, very often mothers in, for example, Palestine, Israel, Palestine, or Northern Ireland, still there is this idea around. I wonder if any of you and any of your subjects had any sense at all that there was any truth in this idea.
Who wants to go first?
The idea that women, are more peaceful, or fundamentally, that if women were running the show, there would be less war.
And Claire was obviously working for the LNU at the start of her career, so she was in what was a peace movement of sorts. It's collective security. So they were sometimes accused of being pacifists. They said they weren't, but they organised the biggest referendum in the UK in, I think, 1935, the peace ballot. She organised it for Leicester. She actually became the Labour designate MP for Leicester pre-war. No election came, so she never stood. So there was that side. But actually, she was at the same time, even though it's completely contrary to LNU policy, she was investing in Vickers, major arms manufacturing companies. So she obviously sensed that there was a war coming, and it was a good investment. And actually, her attitude to warfare, it's odd, because she can be a thoughtful person, but you ask her what she really likes. Oh, I love a good war. She'd say something like that, and you go, "Come on, Claire. Do you really mean that?" And then she would probably back off if you pick her up on it. But she, on that sense, she's very unthoughtful about it. There's nothing she enjoys more. I remember when she was in her God, it'd be late 80s, we'd go on to aircraft carriers in Hong Kong when the US would bring an aircraft carrier in, and she would totter up these step ladders, vertical ladders. Her shoes would sometimes come off because she wore these really dainty little shoes, and we'd be up on an aircraft carrier. There's nothing she enjoyed more than being up close to a major piece of warfare. I mean, I think she said to Claire, to Sue Lawley, there's nothing what I enjoy more than being in an aircraft that's bombing something. Now, let's face it, that's a ridiculous thing to say, but, if you've picked her up on it, she'd back off. She'd say, well, I mean in the sense of, but, actually, she really, she got off on it.
Do you have any thoughts on?
Well, I think for someone like Gerda Taro, it's very hard to say, because you're talking only about one war, and that for someone like her, actually, it was more that events were bigger than her, and she had no choice, because don't forget that, of all the international people who went to fight in Spain, the people who were there with the greatest passion were the German anti-Nazis. So the Germans who were fighting against Nazism had experienced it firsthand, and so their reason for being there was this kind of largely unheard cry into the darkness to try and stop the march of fascism from spreading any further. And I think a lot of them sincerely believed, and certainly hoped, that at the end of the Spanish Civil War, if they were victorious, that that they would have succeeded. So I couldn't really answer it in those kind of terms for someone like Gerda, because it was pain, it was pain and it was suffering, and she wanted to bear witness. So I don't think there was a kind of element of choice about it for her.
Do you have any thoughts?
Can you remind me what the question is?
Are women, are we sort of passive? Would we make the world more peaceful if we were in charge?
What does that have to do with journalism?
Yeah.
I hope someday we have a chance to find out.
Thank you. It's a good way to end that. Thank you ever so much. Thank you to all our panelists. Okay, thank you everyone.
Thank you very much.